I've seen my fair share of strange things working in a tanning parlor. I've seen old women who've used the bed so often that their skin could be mistaken for a second-hand leather jacket. I've seen people plagued with all sorts of skin problems, like acne and eczema. Then they blast themselves with those rays in desperate hope. I've even seen overconfident first-timers who tell me that they can handle the machines, only to come out with their skin scarlet enough to hide the embarrassment on their faces. The one thing that I never thought I'd see, though, was a vampire. The tanning salon that I work in is very small and very hard to find. It nestles in between two disgusting storage buildings on a dark and cobbled side street just outside of Glasgow. Now, if there's one industry that benefits from the terrible Scottish weather, it's the sunbed business. During the day, the shop does get pretty busy, with customers of all ages and genders paying the few pounds for a dose of UV rays. Now, I haven't seen a shop like this, though, as I work the night shift in here. You're probably wondering why a tanning salon would be open during the night. Well, I was 2 when I first applied for the job, and the owner told me that everywhere was starting to offer services 24 hours a day. A new 24/7 had opened a few streets over. He was an eccentric little man who would sometimes bound around the shop for hours, making sure that everything was clean and tidy for the customers. Then I wouldn't see him for months, and I never understood his logic. I don't think that he really did either. Predictably, my night shift only saw a few customers per week, and sometimes I would sit from 10 p.m. until 7 a.m. without seeing a single soul. I didn't really mind, though. My wages were still being paid, and all I had to do was sit at the desk by myself and browse the internet all night. When I started working there, I was in my second year of my philosophy degree, and I'm still here, a year after I left uni, as soon as I realized that there wasn't a whole lot of philosopher jobs out there. I remember when I first told my dad what I was going to study for.
Oh, aye, 'cause that's handy. Because they've just opened up a big fucking philosophy factory in the city.
He groaned sarcastically at me. And I think that I had always known that it would be hard to get a job. But I was young and so full of opinions. It would have been nice to be able to afford to move out of my parents' house, though. I came to know a few of the customers, and quite well enough, though, as though they were mostly regulars. When I'd ask them why they were coming into a tanning salon at 2 a.m., they would always give me the same kind of response. They liked the privacy that the darkness of night brought with it. Frank was one of my most regular customers. I'd usually see him 3 or 4 times a week. The poor bastard had the worst eczema that I'd ever seen. I mean, his whole face and neck were covered in scaly, red skin. Frank always had this smile on his face, though, and swore that the sunbeds were great for his condition. I never did see any improvement in him, but I never warned him of how dangerous too much tanning here would pose. Who was I to judge? I think it's always very important to remember that you can't judge the actions of someone who is suffering from something that you'll never understand. So, what about that vampire, I hear you ask? Well, it was one particularly quiet night in the spring, when just after midnight, a small, innocuous-looking man pushed his way past the rickety wood door. I had never seen him in the shop before, but we did get the occasional newbie. "Evening," I said, looking up from my PC. "Nice to meet you," he replied with a wry smile and a well-to-do English accent. He was a dumpy-looking man, with pasty white skin and thinning curling hair atop his oddly shaped head. He must have been in his 50s, maybe, but the bags under his eyes and generally disheveled look made him appear a lot older. "Better booth?" I asked, almost robotically, like I was programmed to. "Oh, no," he laughed. "I'm not ready for that just yet." He shuffled towards me. An old duffel bag which hung off his shoulder made metallic clangs as he walked. He stopped just short of my desk and stood there, a friendly smile on his face. He looked me up and down, and then I saw him silently mouth, "Jamie," as he read my name badge. "James Jones Esquire," he said with an outreached hand. "But it's Jim to my friends." I shook it cautiously. He had cold, rough hands and an oddly powerful grip for a small guy. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Jones." No, please. Call me Jim," he said with a wink. And I scanned him, then his bag. This was certainly a bit strange, but I did crave something different to break the monotony. Well, if you're here to try and sell something, you've got the wrong guy. I just work here. I gestured to his bag. Ah, well, yes and no. You see, old chap, I'm here to sell something to you in particular. An opportunity. He had definitely piqued my interest. I mean, I was pretty sure that he was batshit crazy, but his demeanor was so friendly and relaxed that I didn't feel ill at ease at all. So, you're not here to use one of the beds? Well, that depends on how our conversation goes. He laughed and clapped his hands together. May I sit? Sure. They never had these sorts of places when I was a lad. Smashing things that they are. He spoke as he sat across from me, looking around with a wondrous gaze. I must have had one hell of a bemused face on me at that moment. Who was this weird little man? Had he certainly made my night more interesting? You know, I've lived in this city for years, and I would never have known that this place was here. Such an odd little spot. Wouldn't you agree? He asked as he scrunched up his face. Yeah, I mean, it's a busy little place. During the day, I guess, but at night, not so much. And he nodded his head. 24 access to the sun. That must attract a few curious folk, eh? Not really. In fact, you're the first person to walk in here since I started my shift. Ah, well, you see, I'm a bit of a night owl, he laughed as I studied him. And after a few moments of silence, he said, Well, Jamie, I'm sure that you're wondering who this strange fellow is that sits before you, and probably more importantly, what it is that he wants. Yep, that's about right, I smiled. Well, Jamie, I want, or rather hoped, that you'd help me kill myself tonight. He beamed and flicked his wrists out with a glee. I sputtered and laughed, taken aback by his excited tone and twisted words. Wait, you want me to what? Oh, I'm sorry, old chap. Maybe I rushed into that a bit there. I'm just a tad excited. Perhaps I should explain myself a bit. Yeah, please do. I was still laughing nervously, yet I was more fascinated than anything else at this point. Well, the 3 things that you should know about me, and you already know one, is that my name is Jim Jones. My age, 126 years young, and last but not least, I'm a vampire. I knew it. Batshit crazy. Okay, so you're telling me that you are a 126-year-old suicidal vampire who just walked into a tanning salon? Kind of sounds like the start of a shite joke, doesn't it? And he cackled and slapped his knee. Oh, yes, quite. I know it all seems a bit ridiculous, doesn't it? He wiped a tear from his eye as he chuckled away. What do you find most difficult to believe? That I want you to help me kill myself? That I'm a vampire? Or that I'm 126 years old? Personally, I don't think that you look like a Jim, I sneered cordially. And Jim started laughing. Like, really big belly laughs, and so did I. There was just something charming about this amicable little man, even if he had a screw loose. And after he had settled down, he took a slightly more serious tone. So, I was over having supper at a friend's house early in this evening, he began before I interrupted. Wait, can vampires eat supper? I asked jokingly. Oh, yes, my boy. There's a lot of hogwash these days in the movies and television, but eating a good meal is one of my favorite pastimes. He rubbed his pudgy belly. Anyways, where was I? Oh, yes. Just before supper, I happened upon an article, which I began to read and found it absolutely enthralling. It was a controversial old subject about euthanasia. Euthanasia? I said, my interest perked again. Yes, old chap. An article that you had written. I must say that it really blew my socks off. And then it began to make some sense. My old professor at uni had loved my year-end essay on the right to choose principles, and he'd mentioned that he'd sent it off to a few of his magazine editor friends. I'd written all about the controversy of those Swiss suicide clinics and how governments shouldn't be allowed to tell a person when they can die. I was pretty proud of my paper at the time. but then I truly believed in what I was writing. I think Jim must have sensed my excitement because his smile grew wider. Oh, wow, I had no idea that was even published. My professor didn't even mention a word about it to me. My hand was on my forehead, trying to stay as humble as I could. What even magazine was it? Do you have it with you? Oh no, why that would be frighteningly rude to take a magazine from your host's house now, wouldn't it? Was it maybe Philosopher Now? I'm sorry, lad. For the life of me, I just simply can't recall. I was so excited that I even started penning an email to my old professor right then and there, thanking him and asking him where he had managed to get it printed. It was only after that it was sent that I remembered why Jim was there. I had been swept up in the excitement of it all. But he just sat there, though, patiently waiting on me to finish with the same amicable face. Wait, how did you find me? I asked. Well, I saw your name, and my friends helped me to find you on, that book face thing. It said that you worked here. Wonderful thing about the internet, it really is. I'm useless with technological equipment, though. My friends weren't much use either. We had a right bickering match trying to work out this blooming thing. Being looked up online like that did creep me out a little, but I still felt pretty at ease with this strange little fellow. I wouldn't worry about it. My dad's around the same age as you, and he can barely answer his phone. Is he? Indeed. Jim smiled. Oh, sorry, maybe not quite as old, I joked. Then reality bit again. So wait, you want me to help you kill yourself because of my article? Why, yes! As I was reading, I thought to myself, now here's a chap that truly understands the plight of someone who wants to leave this earth with dignity. One line that really stuck in my mind was that when you had mentioned something like, we don't choose how we want to enter this life. It's only fair that we choose how we want to leave it. Marvelous, lad. Truly marvelous stuff. I was a bit of a mixed bag of emotions then. I was so thrilled that my work had finally been published and that people, even just one madman, had connected with it. Now, on the other hand, I was a bit more wary of Jim now. And I was beginning to think that he was seriously going to hurt himself. Why do you even want to do this? Are you sick or something? No. Vampires don't get sick like mortals do. Maybe one of the only benefits of this godforsaken life is that I haven't had a cold since 1956. And then he took a somber tone. I want to die because of what I'm becoming. A monster. And I looked at him. This man genuinely believed that he was a vampire. What do you mean? Well, you see, in the beginning, everything wasn't that bad. I had my lovely wife, Norma, by my side, and she stood by me even when I couldn't stand outside in the daylight. She really understood and had helped me then, but she grew older and older, and I stayed like this, forever until my twilight years. Oh, I said, suddenly getting an idea. So you're feeling this way because your wife passed? Norma died in 1978, boy, long before you were even born. I've married since then. Jean passed in 1991, then there was Wilma, who passed a few years back. You see, I'm cursed to live and love while others are blessed with morality and the sweetness of a flickering life. And then his head was in his hands now. Have you maybe thought about seeing a psychiatrist, Jim? None of them have ever been able to help me, lad. You see, I'm so alone. I've only ever met one other vampire, and that's the one that turned me into this. And I wouldn't want to meet him again. Frightful fellow that he was. Jim had went from being a jovial chatterbox into a sad man, bleeding his soul to a stranger. And I was beginning to feel a little uncomfortable. Look, Jim, maybe I'm not the best person to speak to on this matter. I mean, yeah, my essay was on the subject, but the hunger, Jamie, it grows. As I grow colder towards humanity, I try and I try, but it gnaws at me. You said it yourself in your piece that you wrote about how a man should be able to end his life if he feels that it would endanger others. And I will, Jamie. I've done it before. And Tonight was the final straw, Jim said, wiping his tears and regaining his composure. And then a tension filled the room. I've tried to take my own life twice before. The first time I threw myself into the street in the middle of the day, and I was engulfed by the flames. I was too much of a coward to go through with it, though. And that's all I am at the end of the day. This guy had some serious problems. I told myself I was beginning to think about calling the police. And what was the second time? Do you know what happens when you try to stake a vampire and you miss the heart, lad? I sure didn't. He trailed off, looking at his scuffed shoes. When Jean found out what I was, she was horrified, so she was. And so I asked her to kill me. Wooden stake, I'd heard. And then he took a long pause, staring reflectively off to the left before slowly turning his head back towards me. Do you know what happens when you miss my boy? He looked straight at me. His eyes seemed darker. And I gulped. I may have been more than a foot and 100 pounds on him, but he was absolutely terrifying in that moment. And the tension built as he awaited my answer. And then a loud ding startled me, but Jim barely flinched. Hoya, Jimbo, Frank said as he strolled in towards his usual bed. I tried to make eye contact with him to signal that something was up, but Frank had a habit of not looking people in the eye, just keeping his head down and hoping that no one would ask him any questions. And when I turned back towards Jim, he was sitting there with a big, goofy smile on his face. Jesus, what in God's name is wrong with that poor chap's face? He asked in a hushed tone. Frank has eczema. Really bad eczema. Oh, and your fancy sun machine helps him? Maybe. Well, I don't really know. He seems to think so who am I to say? Exactly, my boy. How can we judge others if we don't understand their problems? Jim looked at me knowingly. I think I had written something along those lines in my essay. I paused for a moment before asking, Jim, did you see the way that Frank smiles when he walks in through here? I mean, the unfortunate guy has to deal with that, and he does so with the right attitude. Don't you think that you can do the same thing with whatever's going on with you? Jim sat back contemplating my question before leaning in again. That chap still has hope, though. You think that he'd still be smiling if he realized that those machines don't help him? That he's cursed to walk this earth like that? No. The day will come when he'll be sitting here where I am. Look, I get that you've got problems. We all do. What makes you think that I can help you, though? I'm just a guy who works in a tanning salon. Can't you find someone else? Jamie, now listen. I like to think of myself as a civilized chap. I was a well-respected member of the community that I grew up in. You know, before this happened to me. I have to leave on my terms. I want to leave with dignity. I felt this way for years, but reading your work tonight, I know that you're the one who can help me. He began laughing again. It's just one of life's beautiful little coincidences that you work in a place like this. Wouldn't you agree? And I felt real pity for this man. He was so confused and suffering from such wicked mood swings. He'd laugh one minute, telling me a joke, and then the next he would grow stern, almost aggressive. And then he would plead for me to help him. It must have been a good 20 minutes of this, back and forth. Frank still hadn't emerged, and I had almost forgotten that he was there. I had wondered if he was sitting, listening to all this. Still, Jim didn't seem to care if he was, though. And eventually, Jim pulled his duffel bag closer to him and began to unzip it, ensuring that I couldn't see its contents. And he withdrew a white piece of fabric, buckets, straps. And then it dawned on me that it was a straitjacket. What the fuck? I asked, puzzled. All you have to do is put me in this, and then tie this around me, he said, withdrawing a clunky-looking metal chain, and strap me into one of those machines. That'll do the trick, I'm sure. And then he took an urn from the bag. And then just sweep me into this here when you're done. I would prefer that you scatter me into the ocean, but anywhere scenic would do, really. I'm not too fussy. Jesus, Jim, You're fucking crazy, man. Why is it so crazy that I want to leave this forsaken life? I never chose it. It was thrust upon me. Won't you please help me, lad? I thought that you understood this sort of thing. And I stood up, ready to throw this loony out of my shop. For starters, Jim, I don't believe that you're a fucking vampire. I think that you're mentally ill. Well, hey, steady on now there, son. If you've ever hurt anyone, I think that you really need to go and tell the police. Did you kill your wife? And Jim looked away, dropping all of the equipment that he had in his hands, and it rattled against the hard floor. And he walked towards the window, staring out into the cold night. I did. I never meant to, though. You'll just have to trust me on that. Believe me, I've killed more than my fair share. And I felt nothing. My humanity is fleeting, Jamie. I can feel the last of it leaving me. And that's why you'll have to do this tonight, before I hurt anyone else. I can't do it by myself. I'm such a goddamned coward. I had backed off, standing behind my desk, and I slowly reached for my phone to call the police. This man was unhinged at best, and at worst, I dreaded to think that if he wasn't lying about hurting all those people. Your machines here are perfect for the job, my boy. The old stake to the heart is far too dangerous for you. If you missed, well, I can't really describe it, but that monster inside of me takes control when I'm under attack. Do you understand? He was still looking out the window as he spoke calmly. Sure, yeah. No problem, I began as I fumbled around the desk in panic. So you'll help me? Jim turned, smile as wide as the room. I had already dialed 9 on my phone when I noticed an email on my computer from the corner of my eye. Now, you're probably thinking, to hell with the email, phone the police. And you'd be right. I probably should have. But an uglier picture was beginning to emerge. The message was from my old professor, and it read, Hi, Jamie. Long time no speak. Can't sleep either? Sorry, I don't know what you mean by, where is it published? Did you ever send me a copy of your piece? Because I never received it. Sorry about that. Should have gotten back to you sooner. How are you, by the way? Speak soon. Professor Murray. I could see that Jim was looking at me as I read, but he continued to stand patiently, that smile on his face. Where did you say that you read my article, Jim? I began to mumble. What's that, lad? My article was never published. The only place that you could have read it was my house. And Jim's smile dropped as he sighed disappointedly, pacing towards his duffel bag. Oh dear. I was really hoping that it wouldn't come to this. He reached into his bag for its final contents. A splintered wooden stake and a blood-speckled paper copy of my article. And the dots were beginning to join in my head. Where did you get that? You know, I wasn't lying about the hunger, my boy. I really do try to control myself. But I just can't sometimes. What have you done? I started flicking through my phone to call my mom to make sure that she was... But he continued to speak. Tonight is the worst that I've ever felt after I've eaten supper in a long time. I just couldn't control my urge any longer. I wanted the taste. I needed it, he growled so fiercely and loud that I froze in fear. But then he returned to that calm demeanor, placing the steak and the article on the table. It wasn't personal, Jamie. They were just the first people that I saw. I snuck in through the kitchen when it happened upon your dining room table. He pointed to the article. It really caught my attention. I sat and I read the whole thing. It really is marvelous stuff. And I hit the call button on my phone and I listened. And I heard it ring. Once, twice. Then I realized that the ringing was coming from Jim's pocket. And he continued barely acknowledging it. After I had finished, I was honestly just going to leave. Your article gave me that hope that I was talking about earlier. The idea that someone would show me enough mercy to put me out of my misery. I really am truly sorry, my dear boy. What? What did you do to my parents? Jim sighed again, looking down sorrowfully. They walked in and saw me there. And then that primal hunger came in at the forefront, and I just can't control it. I know that I told you that you were the one for this job because that you understood how important dying with dignity is. And that is true. But there was another reason that. I wronged you tonight. A wrong that cannot be righted. And you deserve to be the one to end my story. You're a sick psychopath! I grabbed his arms and I pushed him back against the door. Oh, I was hoping that we would be able to do this in a more civilized way, but I feared that it would come to this. He groaned as he fell to the floor. Take that stake. End my wretched life. This is your opportunity. I can't explain it. But the rage that built up inside me to that point had grown so much that I actually complied with the maniac. In one move, I grabbed that piece of splintery wood and then I was on top of him, bringing it down upon him again and again. And he squealed in agony but kept his arms by his side as I staked his chest and neck over and over. And his blood sprayed my face, fueling my hatred as I hacked away. And after it was all over, I sat by his mangled body, totally drenched in blood. Frank had finally emerged as he stood gaping at me from the entrance to the sunbed room. He killed my mom and dad, I sobbed as the reality set in. But Frank was speechless, his eyes wide with terror, and he surveyed the room. And I looked up, about to tell him to phone for the police, when I noticed that he wasn't looking at me anymore. Rather, his eyes moved to something that was behind me. Standing behind me. I warned you about missing, boy. And then I felt like a small car had collided with me as I was bundled into my stomach by Jim, his bone-breaking strength like nothing that I had ever felt. A sharp pain rang through my body as his teeth sank into my neck, and I let out a desperate scream. I could feel the blood draining from my body. And I tried to signal Frank to help, but he was frozen. In his best efforts, all he did was shout for him to get off of me. I think that was the first time that Jim noticed that he was standing there as his teeth withdrew from my neck and his head snapped towards Frank. I remember Frank saying, "Oh shit," as he stumbled backwards. The beast on top of me was so quick though. He moved almost like a panther. With one leap, he bounded onto the wall where Frank stood and then kicked himself diagonally across the other side of the hall, and then with one final launch, he threw himself at Frank, all without touching the floor. Both of them crashed into the sunbed room, the cheap door splintering from Jim's sheer strength. And I lie there dying, blood oozing from my neck as I gasped my last breath. And I kept my eyes trained on the doorway though, hoping to see Frank emerge. And I never did. What I did see was a brilliant light as the lid of the sunbed cracked off its hinges in the struggle. The whole room was bathed in the UV glow, which flooded out of the bed and illuminated me. And I heard Jim scream. Well, more like a howl as he stumbled out with burning flesh, engulfed in flames as he made his way past me, and with a beleaguered moan, he threw himself out the shop window. And I managed to see him one last time before everything faded to black. He was stood outside, his red eyes fixed on mine. His skin was blackened and bubbling, and I can still smell that stench. He pursed his lips into a disappointing wince, shaking his head as he turned and took off into the night. And I gasped once, twice, and then died. I suppose in some sense I actually died. I actually awoke a few hours later as I was being dragged from the tanning salon. I could still smell that putrid burning flesh, and I thought that Jim may have been the man who had me by my shoulders. But when I looked down, however, I realized that it was my arm that was engulfed in flames, bubbling my skin into horrible blisters. The UV light, which had saved me earlier, was now burning me. The man then laid me on the ground, where we were a few meters from the salon, and stamped the fire out with his boots. I howled in agony with each crunch before the flames finally died. And then I peered up to see my savior. He was a tall, handsome man with a face that was also familiar to me. It was Frank. I barely recognized him without the thick, red scales on his body. "Frank?" I mumbled. He looked down and smiled at me. The first time that I think that we'd ever made true eye contact.
"Hi, Jimbo,"
he beamed back at me.
"Look at my face."
And so that's how my story began. Frank helped me tidy up the shop before the morning shift, and I told the owner that we'd been robbed last night and that they trashed the beds and even stole the video cameras and the footage. My wounds all healed within minutes, and Frank never even had the slightest touch of eczema since that night. Because now we too were night owls. I never saw Jim again, but he was right about the coldness that you feel inside once you're like him. I mean, I felt sad that my parents were brutally murdered, of course, but it wasn't like it should have been. Anyway, not much has really changed for me, really. Well, I have my own house now, and I still work night shift in the salon, and you'd be surprised how little sun there actually is that affects you when you're living in Scotland. Yes, I do understand the irony of a vampire working in a tanning salon, by the way. Frank points this out every time I see him. He still comes in every now and then, updating me on how great his life is now that he's out meeting girls and making friends. One man's curse is another man's blessing, I guess.